The convent of Santa Beatrice was once a peaceful retreat, a sanctuary for those seeking solace in prayer and spiritual devotion, far from the distractions of the outside world. But everything changed the day Sister Isabella arrived. Tall and commanding, she was not the typical figure in a place of quiet reflection. Her reputation, filled with awe and fear, had traveled before her. Sister Isabella had faced unimaginable hardships in distant lands, emerging with unwavering faith and strength. When appointed to oversee the novices' training, no one knew what to expect, but soon, they would realize that her methods would push them beyond anything they had ever imagined. The morning Sister Isabella arrived at the convent. The atmosphere was different. Attention hung in the air as the novices gathered in the great hall, preparing to meet their new instructor. Most were young and idealistic, eager to dedicate their lives to prayer and service to God. But when Sister Isabella entered, everything changed. Her presence was immediate and commanding. The novices' gazes shifted, drawn to her, their hearts racing. She said nothing at first, simply standing still, her eyes scanning the room, as if reading the depths of each soul before her. When she finally spoke, her voice was firm, unyielding, yet there was an underlying compassion that softened its intensity. "The world out there is not an easy place," she said, her eyes locking with each novice. "Faith alone is not enough to face it. You must be strong, ready to resist every temptation. Only then will you be truly ready for your vow." The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. The novices exchanged puzzled glances, unsure of what to make of her statement. Sister Clara, always the most vocal of the group, raised her hand in confusion. "Sister Isabella, what do you mean? Aren't we here to pray and serve God?" she asked, her voice trembling with uncertainty. Sister Isabella's gaze shifted to Clara, her stare piercing and unrelenting. "Yes," she responded calmly, "but that is not enough. You will face challenges far greater than you can imagine. If you cannot resist temptation here, in this safe place, how will you stand against it in the world outside?" Her voice was calm, but there was a quiet force behind it that left no room for doubt. The novices stood in stunned silence, the implications of her words slowly taking hold. Their world, their understanding of faith, was about to be turned upside down. They didn't know it yet, but Sister Isabella's training would test them in ways they had never expected. The next day, the novices gathered in the great hall for what they thought would be another lesson in prayer and discipline. But what Sister Isabella had in store for them was nothing like they had expected. When she entered, her commanding presence settled over the room like a heavy cloak. Without a word, she instructed the novices to remove their traditional habits, the symbols of their devotion that had sheltered them from the distractions of the outside world. They were to replace them with something altogether foreign to the convent: short skirts, tight shirts, and high heels. The novices stared at the clothes in shock, their eyes widening with disbelief. Sister Isabella's gaze was steady, unwavering. She had already seen their discomfort, and it didn't faze her. Sister Sophia, the most outspoken among them, was the first to react. Her face flushed with embarrassment, and her voice trembled with indignation as she protested. "This is not right. We can't dress like this. It goes against everything we stand for." Sister Isabella remained calm, her expression unreadable. "I know," she replied quietly, her voice laced with authority. "And that's exactly why we're doing it. You must learn to resist temptation, even in a controlled environment. If you can't resist here, in this sanctuary, how will you stand strong when the world outside challenges you?" The words hung heavy in the air, and for a moment, the novices were silent. The idea that their faith, something so sacred to them, could be tested in such a way was difficult to comprehend. The habit they had worn for so long was a shield, a protection against the distractions of the world. And now, Sister Isabella was asking them to strip that shield away and confront their own vulnerabilities. There was an awkward stillness as the novices hesitated, looking to one another for guidance, for reassurance. The clothes seemed almost like a challenge, a test not just of their faith, but of their identity. How could something as simple as an outfit be a trial? And yet, the discomfort they felt was undeniable. One by one, they reluctantly changed into the outfits, each novice struggling with her own feelings of shame and self-doubt. Sister Sophia, her face still flushed with embarrassment, walked first, her steps unsure, her gaze lowered to avoid meeting anyone's eyes. Sister Clara, usually so confident, walked next, but the tension in her posture was evident. Even the normally quiet Sister Emily, who had been hopeful about Sister Isabella's methods, seemed torn as she moved across the hall. Sister Isabella stood in the corner, observing them silently, her eyes sharp as she took note of every reaction. She wasn't just watching their movements. She was watching for signs of hesitation, of doubt, of weakness. She knew this was more than just about clothing. It was about testing their ability to resist, to stay true to their faith even when everything around them pushed them to do otherwise. The novices walked across the hall in silence, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the otherwise quiet room. Some of them seemed to hold their heads high, though their eyes still darted nervously around. Others looked at the floor, as if avoiding the gaze of others, ashamed to be exposed in such a way. Sister Isabella's gaze never wavered as she studied them, noting each subtle shift, each flicker of uncertainty. The challenge had just begun, but it was already clear that this was no ordinary training. Sister Isabella was not interested in making them comfortable. She was interested in making them strong. And for some of the novices, this first trial was a shock to the system, forcing them to confront their beliefs, their vulnerabilities, and the very core of their faith. As the days passed, the atmosphere in the convent began to change. The tranquil halls that once echoed with the soft murmurs of prayer and reflection were now filled with tension and the weight of Sister Isabella's trials. Her methods grew progressively more intense. What had started as a lesson in resisting outward temptations now delved deep into the emotional and mental core of each novice. Every day seemed to bring a new challenge, pushing the young women further and further beyond their comfort zones. The novices were no longer simply asked to withstand the discomfort of their clothes or their surroundings. Now, Sister Isabella was testing them in ways that left them feeling vulnerable, exposed, and, at times, broken. One of the hardest trials came for Sister Clara, the most outspoken among them. Clara had always prided herself on her resilience, but what Sister Isabella had in store for her that day would shatter her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Sister Isabella instructed Clara to stand before a mirror, where she was to face not just her own reflection, but the harsh words of another novice who would tear into her self-worth. It was a grueling trial, meant to expose Clara's deepest insecurities, and it began with the voice of Sister Emily, who had been chosen to follow Sister Isabella's exact instructions. "You're weak, Clara," Sister Emily spat, her voice filled with venom. "You'll never make it in the world outside. You think you're strong, but you're nothing." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. Each syllable pierced her heart, and her body stiffened as she tried to hold her composure. But no matter how hard she fought, the weight of the accusations was too much. Her face twisted with hurt, and before she knew it, tears began to fall. She tried to wipe them away quickly, but the dam had already broken. She collapsed to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. "I can't do this," Clara cried, her voice shaking with pain. "This isn't fair." Sister Isabella, who had been standing silently in the corner, watching with a steady gaze, approached her with unnerving calmness. There was no sympathy in her eyes, no softening of her gaze. Instead, she spoke in a voice that carried both compassion and cold reality. "The real hardship will come when the world judges you," she said softly, but firmly. "When strangers try to tear you down, you must learn to withstand them. Only then can you truly be free." For Clara, those words cut deeper than any of the harsh criticisms. She had never felt so vulnerable, so utterly powerless. In that moment, she understood something essential, but it was almost too much to bear. She wasn't sure if she could ever be strong enough to withstand the cruelty of the world. And yet, there was a part of her that understood the harsh truth behind Sister Isabella's words. If she couldn't face this moment, if she couldn't find the strength to rise from the floor, How could she ever face the outside world? But Clara was not the only one struggling. As the days wore on, the trials began to take their toll on the other novices. Sister Sophia, once the most confident and resolute of the group, began to falter. The pressure of the emotional and physical tests weighed heavily on her, and one evening, in a rare moment of vulnerability, she confided in Sister Emily. "I can't take it anymore," Sister Sophia whispered, her voice tinged with defeat. "I don't understand why we have to endure all of this. This isn't what I expected. I thought we were here to pray, to serve. Why are we being broken down like this?" Sister Emily, who had seen her own doubts rise with each passing day, looked at her friend with a mixture of weariness and resolve. The doubt she had once felt was being replaced by a different feeling, one of clarity. She was starting to understand what Sister Isabella was trying to do, even if it wasn't easy to accept. "I've had my doubts too," Emily admitted softly, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "But I believe Sister Isabella has a purpose. Maybe this is all meant to prepare us for something much bigger than we realize. I don't know if I'll succeed in all of this, but I want to try." Her words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with both uncertainty and determination. The other novices, who had gathered around them in the quiet of the evening, listened intently. Some of them nodded in agreement, as if they too were starting to see the larger picture. Sister Isabella's methods, though harsh and difficult to endure, were shaping them in ways they couldn't yet fully understand. But not all of the novices shared Emily's perspective. Some were still convinced that Sister Isabella's methods were too extreme, too cruel. They questioned why the trials seemed to push them to the brink of their emotional limits, why they had to endure such pain and humiliation. Yet, despite their uncertainty, none of them dared to leave. They were bound by their vows, by their commitment to the convent and to their faith, and the fear of failure, the fear of admitting they weren't strong enough, kept them tethered to the path. As the days continued, the divide among the novices grew more pronounced. Some embraced Sister Isabella's harsh lessons, believing that these trials would forge them into stronger women of faith. Others struggled to reconcile their faith with the suffering they endured. But one thing was certain: none of them were the same as when they had first arrived at the convent. Sister Isabella had seen to that. She had pushed them to their limits, to the breaking point and beyond. And in doing so, she was shaping them for something far greater than they could have imagined. One evening, after an especially grueling day of trials, Sister Isabella gathered the novices in the chapel. The air felt heavy with the weight of exhaustion, and the room was filled with a silence that only added to the tension. For the first time, Sister Isabella stepped away from her usual stern, commanding demeanor. Standing before them, she seemed smaller, more fragile than they had ever seen her, as if the burden of her own story was too great to keep hidden any longer. Her voice, usually so firm and unyielding, trembled slightly as she began to speak. "When I was young, I was like you," she said, her words quiet but carrying an undeniable weight. "I had faith, but I wasn't ready. I failed. I let temptation consume me, and I made mistakes I still regret." She paused, her eyes distant, as if she was reliving those painful memories. "But God gave me a second chance. He showed me that even in failure, there is redemption." The novices listened intently, their eyes wide with surprise. This was not the Sister Isabella they knew, the woman who had pushed them beyond their limits with unrelenting trials. In that moment, they saw her vulnerability for the first time. "And now," she continued, her voice gaining strength, "I want to make sure none of you face the same fate. I will not let you be unprepared. The world out there will test you, and I need you to be strong. Strong enough to resist the temptations that once consumed me." The room was silent, as the gravity of her words sank in. The harshness they had endured suddenly made sense. Sister Isabella wasn't trying to break them. She was trying to make them strong. Strong enough to withstand whatever the world might throw at them. And in that moment, the novices began to understand the true depth of her mission. They were no longer just facing trials, they were facing a teacher who had once fallen, but had risen again to ensure they wouldn't have to. The final trial was the most personal of all. Sister Isabella instructed each novice to write a letter to themselves, a letter that would lay bare their deepest fears, their doubts, and their hopes for the future. It was a deeply intimate exercise, one that forced them to confront the truths they had been running from, to face the raw, unfiltered realities of their hearts. As the novices sat in silence, some of them wept openly, their pens moving slowly across the pages as they poured out the emotions they had kept hidden for so long. Others remained quiet, lost in thought, reflecting on the weight of their pasts and the uncertainty that lay ahead. The room was filled with a sense of vulnerability. Each novice was alone with their thoughts, each one forced to reckon with the very things they had buried deep within themselves. When the letters were finally written, Sister Isabella collected them with the same quiet authority she had always carried. She sealed them away carefully, as if locking away a piece of each novice's soul. "These letters represent your past," she told them gently, her voice soft but firm. "From now on, you will no longer be the same. You are ready for your vow." That evening, in the quiet of the chapel, the novices stood together, their hearts and minds transformed. One by one, they approached the altar, their steps steady and sure, ready to make the vows they had worked so hard to earn. In the presence of the Mother Superior and Sister Isabella, they made their promises, promises that were no longer just words, but declarations of strength, faith, and resilience. Their hearts were renewed, filled with the strength they had earned through their trials, and as they stood before God, they were no longer the same women who had first entered the convent. They were ready for whatever the world might ask of them. Sister Isabella stood silently, observing the novices as they took their vows. For the first time since her arrival, her expression softened, and a faint, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corners of her lips. She had watched them grow, watched them change. The road ahead would be difficult, but she knew, deep down, that they were ready for whatever challenges awaited them. The trials had been harsh, and her methods, though extreme, had shaped them in ways no one could have imagined. They had been tested in fire and forged through adversity. Sister Isabella had not broken them. No, she had built them, stronger, unshakable, and more resilient than ever before. Later that evening, after the ceremony, Sister Isabella retreated to her room. She sat at her desk, and for the first time in years, she took out the letter she had kept hidden away, the letter that held the weight of her past. She held it for a long moment, the pain it contained still sharp, but the weight of it felt lighter now. Without hesitation, she lit the letter on fire, watching as the flames consumed it, the ashes scattering into the wind. As she stood there, the fire crackling in the silence, she whispered to herself, "It's time to leave the past behind." Her purpose was complete. The novices had found strength in their trials, and she had found peace in finally letting go of the past. The convent of Santa Beatrice would never be the same.